Okay, and I need to speak louder. I'm not used to microphones. Usually I'm so loud in the classroom I don't need a microphone. My name is Peggy Nania. I teach art, fine art, and practical arts here on campus. And I want to welcome all of you here. The Homestead Center for the Arts, and guests, friends, faculty, students, welcome. I want to send out a special thanks to the Lecture Luncheon Committee for their work as they put these marvelous presentations together for us. Nancy Coppola, Bob will be talking about in just a second, not able to be with us today. Bill White, Barbara Millenbrook, who many of you got to talk to, make reservations for your lunches. Carla Marcus, who provides the connections for the lunches being here. Bob Jensen, who writes our promotional releases. Mita Jensen, essential to the committee. And we now have Blaine Vernicek. I had to take a breath on that one, it's the first time. And Katie Jackson for documentation. And I'd like to introduce Bob. We'll continue with the introduction of our guest today.
Okay, thank you. I want to explain why Nancy is not here today. It's rather ironic. She tripped over her cat in the kitchen and fell and broke her leg. The person for whom this series of lectures is named was Bea Pesko, who at about the same stage in life tripped over a cat, fell, and I think she broke her shoulder and her arm. So if you're associated with this committee, you better be very careful when you're around cats now, because the pattern is set. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to tell you about the next lecture, which will be 7 April. It'll be given by Charlie Hudson. Charlie, raise your hand. And the topic will be how to create a family memoir. Where's Peggy? Peggy is our speaker in May, and I'm going to ask her to tell us about her program. And it'll be right here at the college, and it will not be the first Monday, it'll be the second Monday, because the college will be closed down on the first Monday. Peggy? Thank you, Peggy. Our speaker today is Bob Degross. He's the Chief of Interpretation and Public Affairs at Big Cypress Preserve. He came to Everglades National Park and worked at Shark Valley from 1994 until 2003 when he moved to Big Cypress. How many people here grew up north? Raise your hand. There's Bob is here for the same reason we are. We were tired of shoveling snow and driving on ice, and he came from Wisconsin, but he's been with the Park Service for a considerable amount of time. Bob? And thank you for this wonderful movie.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much, everyone. Nan contacted me a while ago, actually, and she was wondering if anybody did a presentation about the Loop Road that's out in the Everglades, and I advised her that I don't do a presentation specific to the Loop Road, but I do a presentation about the construction of the Tamiami Trail, of which the Loop Road is a portion of that story. So that's what we'll be talking about a little bit. And I'll be repeating myself a little bit, but as you may know, the trail, Tamiami Trail, was completed in 1928. And this was the first film footage that was taken by a person that we know of in 1928. A gentleman, if I'm not mistaken, he's from Pennsylvania, and his name is Augustus Horace Brinkley. And if you go online to the Florida Memory Project, you can find this film footage, and you can find, obviously, other things related to Florida history as well. So I always like to play this before I do my presentation and everything because I find it sort of interesting. And just as Bob had mentioned, I am at Big Cypress National Preserve. And give me a moment to just open this up here. And the preserve is one of 4 national park areas in South Florida that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. Of course, the one that everyone is familiar with is Everglades National Park. And then there's Biscayne and Dry Tortugas National Parks, I should say. And then in 1974, Big Cypress National Preserve was created. So this is actually our 40th anniversary this year. And it neighbors Everglades National Park to the north and to the west. And as Bob, and I might say, I did bring some of our official park maps and guides. They're on the table in the back, so if you have an opportunity to grab one of those, you're more than welcome to. The presentation will be about 45 minutes or so, and afterwards I'll be more than happy to take any questions from people about the topic or any other things that you might have questions about related to the National Park Service and specific Big Cypress National Preserve here in South Florida. And as I said, Nan had asked me to come and talking a little bit about Loop Road, but talking about the Tamiami Trail in general. And when I start my conversation with the Tamiami Trail, the one thing I always like to do is ask people where they're from. And Bob had just asked that. And many of you are from someplace else. There's very few people who are from Florida, really, if you think about it. As a matter of fact, I was speaking to somebody earlier who is a 3rd-generation Floridian. Any other multiple generational Floridians here? A few. This is actually the first time I've done this presentation where there was more than 3, to tell you the truth. It's sort of interesting. We're all from someplace else, aren't we? But something drew us down here into Florida. And I always like to say that here in Florida, you either come here and you love it and you want to stay for a very long time, or you dislike it very strongly and you want to get out of here as quickly as possible. But it's one thing I always find when I talk to people, when I talk to them about Florida and everything. But really and truly, it's hard to find long-term Floridian residents. I think the longest I've ever found a family here that I've talked with, it was about a 5th or 6th generation family that's been here in Florida, especially South Florida, south of Lake Okeechobee. I actually like to describe Florida as the final frontier of the lower 48 states. Now, a lot of people, when you say that, they automatically, what's the final frontier of the lower 48 states? They always think of the wild, wild west, right? That's where people always think of. But when you think about it, the west was closed, according to the federal government, because they wrote a report in 1890. So they wrote an official report that basically said that the west was closed, the wild west was no longer. And the reason why that is primarily because of the improvement of mass transportation from the east coast to the west coast across the continental United States. Because of the trains and the completion of the several different train lines in about 1890 or so, the transportation of goods and services from the east coast to the west coast and people was so rapid and so easy that they declared the west to be closed in 1890. Does anyone know the largest city in Florida in 1890? Key West. Exactly. Yes, it was Key West. And in a moment, we'll get to why Key West was the largest city in 1890, and actually up until about the early 1900s or so. Does anyone know how large Miami was in 1890? It didn't exist, exactly. Miami was not incorporated as a town until 1896. And a matter of fact, this is Coconut Grove in 1890. It's changed a little bit. So, why is it that Florida was such, and especially South Florida, again, south of Lake Okeechobee, why is it that this place was what I considered the final frontier of the lower 48 states? It's in part because of our geography, as you're all familiar with being down here. This is a map of Florida in 1890. And you can see north of Lake Okeechobee there was, quite a bit of community growing and everything, especially in central Florida with ranching and different things like that. But south of Lake Okeechobee, it was still a pretty wild place. And as I said, Miami wasn't even incorporated at that time. The village of what eventually does become Miami is up on that Atlantic coastal ridge that hugs the Atlantic Ocean on the east side, the southeast corner of the peninsula and everything. But really and truly, once you get off that Atlantic coastal ridge, you're out in that vast wilderness of the greater Everglades. And so that was really a hindrance to things south of Lake Okeechobee really taking off. As a matter of fact, in 1894, the government sent their first explorers to cross the Everglades and explore to see what was out there and everything. And it was by this gentleman whose name is Hugh Willoughby, and he wrote a book. He was with the Army, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, and he wrote a book of his adventures. It's called Across the Everglades in the year 1894. And in his book, he states that the very farmers in the area of Miami know absolutely nothing of what lies just 1 mile west of their fields because it was such an inhospitable place. It was so difficult to traverse and explore. So what changed? What changed here in South Florida to open up the doors so that we have what we have today? I like to say that there's 3 things that changed South Florida. 2 of them, mosquito control and air conditioning. The third one is improved transportation. Those 3 things really opened up South Florida so that we could not only survive down here, but thrive in South Florida. We could very easily move around because of improved transportation, and once we got here from Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota or wherever it was, we could escape into our boxes and make sure we didn't have to deal with the heat or the mosquitoes. So those 3 things changed South Florida, in my opinion, to where we have it today. Prior to vehicles, though, prior to automobiles, what was the way that people traveled across the country, and especially here in Florida? The railroads, but before railroads in Florida, what's that? Water transportation, where this peninsula thrust out into the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. So early transportation for us was whatever type of water transportation could bounce around the coast of this peninsula. And then eventually, obviously, trains came down here, especially with Henry Flagler, and we'll get into more details about his progress coming into Florida here in just a little bit. But you can see, you know, if you are traveling around Florida, it's much easier to take the waterways than it is to try to traverse the wilderness of the Everglades. And because of that, you can begin to see why Key West was the largest city in the state for such a long time, because everyone who was going around the peninsula was going past Key West, and it was also, of course, that great gateway into the Caribbean down to the south of Key West. So that's why Key West was such a popular destination for businesses and things like that. Very important. As you know, eventually Henry Flagler does bring his railroad down here. We're all probably familiar with the story of Julia Tuttle sending Mr. Flagler a orange blossom, showing him that after a very difficult freeze that damaged a lot of citrus groves up in northern Florida, that Miami did not get hit by that at all. So that encouraged him to consider bringing his railroad down eventually into Miami. Well, first he was in St. Augustine, then he moved it down to Palm Beach in 1894, and then in 1896 down into Miami. And of course his goal, wanting to get to Key West, because that was the center of commerce here in Florida, finally getting there in 1912. But what's the unique thing about water transportation and railroad transportation? No traffic lights, a benefit. If what's that? You can't go everywhere. And can everyone go everywhere? At this time, for me, I would not be able to travel by boat at that time. I would not be able to travel by railroad because it was really reserved for the wealthy. It wasn't for the general average person. At this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, for the average workaday person that probably was growing up on a farm, to travel more than 30 miles away from your home was a big thing. And you were definitely probably not doing it by railroad or by boat opportunities unless you had some type of benefactor or something like that. Travel at that time for the average person was very difficult. Here in South Florida, if you were that average person living in Miami and you did want to go to the west, the forms of travel were primarily by canoe. The Miccosukee and Seminole had this down pat. They had their dugout cypress canoes that they would pole through the sawgrass areas. Once they got into a river area, they would paddle them, and then they would actually get out to Biscayne eventually and rig up sails and be able to go across open water using sails and things like that. For some of the farmers and things like that, going across the peninsula south of Lake Okeechobee, it was primarily by ox cart. That was the main way that they traveled. A very rugged trip to go from the Miami area over to Fort Myers. Probably took a good 12 to 15 days by ox cart. And not very many people did it. But there were a few roads that were eventually, very rough ox cart roads that were eventually created. As a matter of fact, there is a woman from Homestead called the ox cart lady of Homestead that typically did this trip alone from Homestead up to the Punta Gorda Homestead area about twice a year or so, taking some of her goods from here up to the Fort Myers area and things. So that's the way travel was taking place here, not only in South Florida, but a lot of different places around the country, primarily by train in the primary continental portion of the United States and everything like that. But then something happened in 1913, and that was Henry Ford, one of our winter residents, came up with the assembly line. And when he developed the assembly line, of course, then the construction of vehicles became, just went off scale, and they were producing so many vehicles and everything. And of course, Henry Ford's, one of his goals was to make sure that everyone was going to be able to afford a Model T. And so in 1913, the mass production of automobiles really changed things across the country. Because towns and villages and cities starting to recognize the importance of the automobile, they recognized that they needed good roads. So there were places all around the country that started these good road committees, basically, that were made up of private businessmen, government officials, and things like that, and they were identifying where they should have these roads crisscrossing the country. Matter of fact, a lot of the early roads in the United States, the automobile improved roads, were private-public partnerships that were done. Yes?
Could we lower the lights a little bit over the screen?
Possibly. Better? Okay, thank you. So these early roads that were being developed across the country were being developed by private public partnerships, and these businessmen and government officials sitting down and saying, okay, where do we want to have these roads? And a matter of fact, Florida, the state of Florida, had its first Better Roads Committee meeting in 1915. They held it up in the Ocala area, if I'm not mistaken. And that's where all these business leaders came together, and they just said, okay, this is where we should consider having roads. And I mentioned this public-private partnership. Some of the great roads around the country, the Columbia Highway that goes through the Columbia River Gorge out in Oregon, the Lincoln Highway, the first east-west highway across the entire United States, the roads that eventually became Route 66. I noticed somebody had a purse here that had a lot of highway symbolization on it and everything. Those roads were public and private partnerships that were created because these towns and business leaders recognized that if they wanted to attract interest in their community, they had to have better roads to get people there. And in this committee meeting that took place in 1915 in the Ocala area here in Florida, the idea of having an east to west cross-peninsula roadway south of Lake Okeechobee was formed. And there were some different ideas of what they should call it and everything like that. And some were saying we should call it the Atlantic to the Gulf Highway, or possibly the Marco to Miami Highway. And finally, they came up with the concept of the Tamiami Trail. And we all know what Tamiami stands for, right? Tampa to Miami, the Tampa to Miami Trail. Tamiami Trail is what they called it in 1915. And these business leaders identified the route that they wanted to take. Basically, what they did is wherever possible, you use the best roads that were there, ox cart roads or carriage roads or things like that. Whatever was there, you wanted to use as much as possible. So coming down into Fort Myers was not a big deal because there were a lot of West Coast roads that connected Fort Myers to different places up to the north. But south and east of Fort Myers was a vast roadless area. As a matter of fact, from what eventually becomes Everglades City to Miami is a 120-mile stretch where there's not even any Europeans living at all. It's all just Miccosukee and Seminole. And there's absolutely no pre-existing roadways in there whatsoever to be able to utilize and things. One thing, look at this map and notice the counties. People don't recognize counties over time change quite a bit. But do you notice Fort Myers over there and the size of Lee County? Notice that, okay? That will become important later on. And also, a lot of people don't realize this. We think of Monroe County as being the Keys. Recognize there is a large portion of Monroe County that is actually on the mainland of Florida, as it still is today. So this is the concept that they decided that they wanted to do. And like I said, connecting the existing roadways down into Fort Myers was not really a big problem at all. But going from Fort Myers to Miami was the major challenge. How do you get this roadway across such a vast wilderness? Fort Myers really didn't support this concept very much. Anyone see why that might be? Yeah, the road ended in Fort Myers. Why do they care if it goes any further, right? So they were not, I mean, they understood that it was important, you know, but they weren't really chomping at the bit to encourage people to go much beyond Fort Myers at the time. So the first people that really saw this as being an important venture were the people in the Miami area. And they were the ones that actually sort of jumped on the bandwagon in terms of starting this project and getting it moving and everything. And a matter of fact, the project started in 1916, moving out of Miami. It was started by a gentleman, his name was James Jowden. And he would like to be called Captain Jowden for some reason. And he started a company that he called the Chevalier Company. It's actually Chevalier, but I understand Floridians pronounced it Chevalier. It's interesting, Chevalier, the name for which he gave his company, was actually named after a very popular pirate out of the Fort Myers area at one time, and also a very prominent plume hunter that used to hunt quite a bit out in the Everglades and everything. But anyways, he called his company the Chevalier Company, and he started work in 1916. And it took him 3 years to go 12 miles. This was a very difficult undertaking, in part because of the vast wilderness that you're working in, but also on the east side, east side of the Everglades, just west of Miami, is actually some of the hardest limestone. So it was very difficult for him to make any forward movement, and it took him three years to just go 12 miles. And eventually what he discovered was that Fort Myers was still just not interested in helping out on this road at all. And so he was slowly losing funds. He was losing his backing because nobody in Fort Myers was interested in helping him out. And so what he does is he turns to business leaders in Monroe County. And he gets backing from Monroe County and the different businesses there to continue his work. But they come up with the concept of abandoning the original approved route of the roadway and just shifting it a little bit so that it goes down into Monroe County. Because, of course, the Monroe County business leaders, if they want to back this, they don't want to build the road in Lee County. They'd much rather have the roadway in Monroe County. So eventually, over a long period of time, Jowden does get out further and further west of Miami. He abandons the original roadway, and so eventually he gets out there so far, and it was becoming so expensive to get goods and equipment out there and everything, that he actually started his own little town out there in the middle of the peninsula in Monroe County called Pinecrest. Has anyone driven Loop Road at all? Have you driven through Pinecrest? If you've driven through, well, yeah, because you probably blinked while you drove through it. It's really only a hamlet of maybe 10 houses that are out there now. But in the late teens and early 20s, when Jowden developed this town out there, and because it was his center of operation, it actually at one time had about 400 people living out there at Pinecrest, which is now out on the Loop Road. And so that was his center of operation. But eventually, once he gets a little bit further west of Pinecrest, his company goes bankrupt and they abandon the project completely. And it's just there. So now the project is basically languishing. You have this road that's going out to Pinecrest from Miami, but doesn't really go anywhere else. Fort Myers is happy that everyone is stopping there and they don't have to go beyond Fort Myers very much at all. But then you have this guy come along, and his name is Barron Collier. He actually got the middle name because he was an only child, and his mother considered him a gift to the family. Barron Collier was born in 1873 in Memphis, Tennessee, and he becomes a very wealthy man. He gets his money because he's an advertising whiz, and he's the guy who all the advertising on the subways and buses and things like that in New York, all of it was Collier Company advertising and everything. So that's how he becomes a very wealthy man. I think it was in 1911, he comes to Florida for the first time. His wife is not feeling well, and they are advised to go to Florida to enjoy the balmy weather. And he comes to Florida, and he's one of those people who fell in love with the place. And he eventually buys a very exclusive island off from Fort Myers called Ucheppa Island. It's still there today. It's actually a private resort. You can still go out there, and his original home is still out there. And he eventually continues his love of Florida to where he becomes the single primary private landowner in Florida, owning more than 1 million acres of land. Because he loved this place so much. And so he decided to, and most of his land is around the Fort Myers area and everything. And so he sees the benefit of this roadway. And he goes to the Florida government and says, I will finish this road across the Everglades from Fort Myers out to Miami. I will finish this road. But what I want you to do is I want you to take all of my land holdings and sort of put them in one spot, and he creates bonds and things like that. And he eventually gets Florida to buy off on this, and this is actually Governor Hardy in 1923 signing the deal, the law, with a variety of different lawmakers and Barron Collier there in the photo, creating Collier County, which encompassed all of Barron Collier's private lands. And then that's how the map changes in 1923 because of this law. Suddenly, a large portion of what used to be Lee County becomes Collier County, and also you notice that Hendry County gets created at the same time. And Barron Collier starts this undertaking of constructing this roadway. He comes down from Fort Myers and eventually takes the roadway to Everglades City. Everglades City, very much like Jowden's operation, when he got out to Pinecrest, it was such a distance that it was difficult to get goods and equipment out there. So what Barron Collier does is he takes this small little fishing village at the mouth of the primary river in Everglades City, which for some reason I forget the name of right now. But he takes a small little fishing village that has several different people that live there. He dredges up a bunch of land and he creates a much larger island. I don't know if you've been to Everglades City, but it's primarily an artificial island that was created by the Collier Corporation so that it could support his center of operation. And he creates, actually, he puts his county seat there at Everglades City, and also has, it's basically a company town at this time in 1923, 1924. And a matter of fact, it had its own currency and everything, so that all the money was just going back to Collier. And then from Everglades City, remember that's where I said from Everglades City to Miami is that 120-mile roadless track for the most part, except for Jones' operation, that vast wilderness area that you had to go out and develop this roadway. So the process was you take the surveyors, and they would have to bushwhack through this wild place. And then once the surveyors go through there and they identify the best route to take the roadway, then you have the people who have to come along and they have to clear the land, preparing it for the machinery and everything that's going to come along. And what they eventually do is they take the materials that they are removing from the roadbed, and they create a very rough railroad track, and then they have carts that they're bringing in equipment and supplies and things like that. And remember, though, this is a wetland, right? Everything that you're going through pretty much is inundated by water for at least 6 months out of the year, if not more than that. So what do you do to create a dry roadbed? What you do is you bring in this piece of equipment that is going to drill down into the limestone, and you set dynamite charges, and you blast the limestone. And then you have, after you blasted the limestone, this walking dredge coming along. And you can see that basically this walking dredge is moving away from me. And in the front of it is that bucket that you see. And that is taking up the blasted limestone that's basically crushed into gravel. And then they drop it over to the side, raising the roadbed so that it's above the water level. And as it's going through, it's creating the canal behind it. A lot of people drive along the Tamiami Trail and they see that canal along the distance, the entire distance of the roadway, and they think it's a water conveyance canal. And it's not. It's just where they got the material to build the road. During this operation, this was the largest consumer of dynamite in the world. And I was telling some people earlier, this is a pretty amazing engineering feat that they did. A matter of fact, at the time, they likened it to building the Panama Canal because it was such an operation. It took 42,000 pounds of dynamite to go 1 mile. It's 120 miles, so that's 4,200 tons of dynamite to construct the roadway across the Everglades. And these items, these dredges, were actually quite an engineering feat as well, because what they did is on the sides of it they have platforms, basically big feet, and when it's ready to move forward, that little shack that you see in the middle actually just lifts up, and then these feet move forward, and it's quite a machine. A matter of fact, they were built in Michigan, actually, Bay City, Michigan. And there were several of them that were used during this process. I think there were a total of about 8 of them that were used during the construction of the roadway, actually. And, what's that?
What fueled it?
They had to bring fuel out to it. It was probably a diesel. It was a diesel engine, actually. As a matter of fact, I think that shack was where the operator lived and also operated the crane, but you can't really see it on that one. But later on, I think there's a picture where you can see the engine on the back of it. There is one of these that are still in existence. It's actually out at Collier Seminole State Park. The wooden parts of this contraption are not there, but all the metal parts are there, so you can still go see one of these that are out on the west coast at Collier Seminole State Park. Now, as this dredge went along, you have the blasting device first. You blast the limestone. You have this dredge come along. It scoops up the limestone and puts it over onto the roadbed to raise the level of the road to ensure that it doesn't get flooded. And then as you're moving along, you have this canal that's there, and then you have these barges with the houses on it. And these are basically where the workers lived while they were out there in the middle of nowhere. And not only that, eventually you have the roadbed that's created up above the surrounding area, and you grade it out. And then once you have the roadbed created, then you can get the first RVs. And these are basically shacks on chassis, and this is where the road workers would live in. You had basically the dredgemen that were doing the limestone and the canal, and then the road workers that were actually forming up the roadbed and everything, and this is where they lived as they went along. And finally, a very long process, the roadway is completed in 1927, late 1927. But do you notice something? Yeah. Collier, for some reason, avoided Jowden's roadway as much as possible. It would have been much easier if he would have just connected to the roadway that Jowden had created, but you do see why he avoided it, right? He kept the roadway in Collier County so that as he develops the area and starts to sell the land, he's selling his land, not Monroe County's land. So that's why you have that little jog in the roadway that eventually is connected with just a short road that connects Jowden's project up to Barron Collier's project, and that's how the loop road gets created. And that's why the loop road is out there in the middle of nowhere. It was just a difference of opinion between these different businessmen that were doing different things. So that's where the loop road comes from. The road was finally completed in 1927. I believe it was actually October or November 1927. 11 years, 1916 to 1927, 11 years to construct at a cost of $7 million in 1920 dollars. If it was to be done today, it would cost approximately $95 million to construct this roadway. In April of 1928, they actually have the grand opening of the roadway. I'm not sure why they didn't do it right away when it was finished, but I'm sure they wanted to plan something and do something big. And so they had this huge event. It was a 3-day event from April 26th to April 28th. The car caravan basically starting in Fort Myers and actually I should say in Tampa, coming down the roadway. Every place that they stopped, they had huge events. In Everglades City was the largest one. They had parades. They had antique cars. No, just kidding. No. They did have parades and everything like that. And it was a big event, Like I said, this was as big as completing the Panama Canal. This was the first roadway east to west across one of the vast wildernesses in the United States. And the event was great, except they forgot 2 things. Gas. I have no idea how they got the gas to travel across, but there were no gas stations for 120 miles across the Everglades. And accidents. Anyone notice the date on that picture? April 26, 1928. The grand opening of the road, the first day that the road was open, basically, was the first accident, and somebody just mentioned they fell asleep at the wheel. Yeah, and it's still, as you know, probably a fairly dangerous road compared to a lot of other roadways across the country. So they forgot 2 things. One is that people needed gas, and more than likely they're going to need assistance out there in the middle of nowhere for that 120-mile stretch, because they were not driving as fast as we do today. I forget what the average speed for a Model T was, but it was much slower than what we go today. So what they did is they eventually built a series of stations across the roadway. And these stations, we don't know very much about them because there's not a lot of documentation. And there's not a lot of documentation for 2 reasons, or one main reason, and that is that Everglades City was the county seat, and it was destroyed for the most part in 1960 by Hurricane Donna. And so a lot of the documentation that existed about different things in the county was destroyed along because of that hurricane and things. So I can't really find a lot of information about these stations that were eventually constructed across the Everglades to assist people. We do know that they were not in service at the time that the road grand opening took place. And the reason why we assume that, and the reason why we assume that is because in all of the media that covered it, there's no mention of these stations at all. So that's what we're assuming. But they were 6 stations across Collier County in the wilderness of the Everglades. They were not very large buildings. They were about 12 feet deep by 24 feet wide. Downstairs, that was basically the first 7-Eleven. It had a sandwich shop. It had the gas station. It sold sodas. It had a restroom. The upstairs, and by the way, the downstairs was managed by the wife. The upstairs was the living quarters for the couple that lived out there in the middle of nowhere. And that was basically their living quarters upstairs. And as I said, the wife managed the store downstairs. The husband's job was to be a patrol officer, basically. It's actually a private police force at this time they were being paid by the Collier Corporation. And their job was to jump on a vintage Harley-Davidson, or a contemporary Harley-Davidson for the time, and they traveled 5 miles one direction, halfway to the next station, and 5 miles the other direction, halfway to the other station, and they just patrolled the road. And they looked very official. Their uniforms that they have here, the uniforms are actually surplus from a Broadway show. They are actually Canadian Mountie uniforms, and for some reason, they were part of this Broadway show, and they got these uniforms, and that's what they did. And what they did is they just patrolled back and forth. They were, of course, helping people, but they were also sort of encouraging people to look at possible land to purchase for future ability to live in the sun in Florida and everything like that. And they are actually considered to be the first motorcycle police and the first sheriffs of Collier County. And 2 of them were actually killed in the line of duty while they were doing this patrol across the roadway and things. The 6 stations, all of them in Collier County. There's one called Belle Meade, Palm Hammock, Fakahatchee, Turner River, Monroe, and Paulita. All of them in Collier County. All of them about 10 miles apart from each other. Again, like I said, that way if anybody needed assistance, they would be able to get assistance. This is the one at Royal Palm Hammock. Now, if you're familiar with where County Road 92 meets 41, that goes down into Goodland, the backside of Marco Island, this store is actually still there. It's still in private hands, and it's still in operation. This is what the Royal Palm Hammock rest area looked like in the 1940s or so. They enclosed that awning that was out in front. They put a cantilevered roof on it. They added a little roadway motor rest opportunity with cabins. And this is pretty much what that station looks like today, the Royal Palm Hammock. The Belle Meade one, which is the one that was furthest to the west, there's some debate on whether that one ever existed. I've talked to some very long-term residents that can never remember whether that station was there or not, but it would have been at the corner of 951 and US 41 in Collier County. This is one that they called Weaver Station. This is the one that's right across, or used to be right across, from the Big Cypress Bend Boardwalk in Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park. Many of you are probably familiar with that because it's a very popular boardwalk to go to. The Weaver Station, it used to be called Fakahatchee Station, but eventually became Weaver, named after one of the patrolmen that lived out of there. This is what the Weaver Station looked like in the 80s, and this was greatly damaged by Hurricane Andrew, and then eventually it was actually burnt down. This is Paulita Station. This is the one that used to be right at the Miami-Dade Collier County line, or just a little bit west of that line, actually. Paulita, I believe Paulita gets its name because of one of Barron Collier's daughters. Her name was Paula, and so this is little Paula, Paulita. And then the one that exists still today, there's 3 of them that exist. The Royal Palm Station that I told you about, the Turner River Station, which was actually moved from its site next to Turner River down into Everglades City, and it was greatly converted and is a private residence now in Everglades City. But when you look at it, you really can't even see that it was one of the stations. And the third one that still exists and is still in the location where it was originally built, or very close to the location that it was originally built, is Monroe Station. And this is the one that you drive by when you go through the preserve, and it's at the corner of the northwest corner of Loop Road and Tamiami Trail, US 41. Munroe Station has been there for a very long time, and it was a very popular place for people who explored the Everglades. Whether you went out in the backcountry to go hiking or on a swamp buggy, or you were driving Loop Road, this was always a very popular place for people to stop and get a hamburger and to get a soda or something like that. The Munroe Station was actually privately owned by the Collier Corporation up until the 1980s, when the Collier Corporation sold some more of its holdings to the National Park Service. The business itself, though, was leased out to a family called the Lords at this time in the 1980s. And eventually, once the Park Service took over the lease of that property, it was shut down, and that's basically what the building almost looks like today. Some of the portions of it were damaged by Hurricane Wilma, and they've been removed. We are doing a very extensive historic analysis of the building, and we're trying to find money to stabilize and restore the building. But it's yeah. And our goal with it, although I'm working with some other people, our original goal was to return it to its 1930s appearance. And the reason for that is because that's why it's considered historically significant. The significance is tied more to the construction of the road and opening up the Everglades to the average person and everything. So that's what we're doing. Although when you go out there, it does look in, and I'm ashamed to say it, but it looks in poor disrepair. A lot of the original fabric is gone. However, I can tell you that the original roof of the building is in good shape and everything. But we are going to salvage as much of the original material as possible and stabilize and restore it. And this is what it would look like. It is quite a bit different. The actual original building is just that center tallest portion right there, or the original portion of the building, I should say. And so this is what our opportunity is to try to get it to look like again. And excuse me, well, I won't go over there, but this is the original, or the layout of the building as it is right now. And you can see that darker square in the lower right-hand corner. That's actually the footprint of the original building. It's only 12 by 24, remember, so it's been added on to quite a bit over a long period of time and things. And, you know, it's sort of been cobbled together and everything. One thing that I find very interesting, you see that little shed that's sort of added into the overall structure and how it's sort of cantilevered, it's sort of cattywampus up there? We actually believe that that is probably one of those original RVs that was just sort of there, and they started using it as a storage shed, and they incorporated it into the building over time and things. But again, that's Munroe Station in the 1930s. You know, the construction of the Tamiami Trail, eventually these stations being built out there, this is actually what the entranceway to Collier County looked like soon after the roadway was completed. This was going from Miami into Collier County, a grand arch announcing that you were entering Collier County and everything like that. When this roadway was completed, it really opened up the Everglades. And remember, earlier I said that the average person didn't travel very much, but once the Model T became so prolific, and some other economic changes were taking place in the United States, you know, people could travel quite freely. And this roadway really opened up Florida. It really opened up the Miami area. And soon after the roadway was completed, it's not ironic that we see one of Miami's first big land booms, you know, when people were moving down here and escaping the cold weather. It opened up the Big Cypress Swamp to logging and eventually to more intensive agriculture over time. It really changed the Miccosukee and Seminole people. You know, for the most part, up until the time that this roadway was done, the Miccosukee and Seminole were a very private, sort of isolated group of people by choice. They wanted to be out in the middle of the Everglades. Now they have this roadway that goes by, and you start to see the Miccosukee and Seminole starting to move their villages closer to the road so that they could, you know, get a living by doing things for the tourists or the visitors that were coming down. You drive across the roadway today, you still see a lot of those villages there, not open to the public, but the villages and the families still remain there. It opened up the Big Cypress Swamp so those people who wanted to explore a little bit deeper could go out there and get off the roadway and go into the backcountry via ORVs and what we call ORVs now. But yeah, it really changed Florida for quite a bit. But it didn't, this whole concept of these roads across the United States, it didn't only change Florida, it changed the United States in general. Because remember, as we were talking about earlier, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were primarily an agricultural society. And like I said, it was a big thing for people to travel a great distance. Now, once these roadways are completed, once a person could afford a Model T, you know, they could jump in their car and do a road trip. For us today, a road trip is nothing. In the 1930s, a road trip was a life-changing event. Not only could you jump in your car and travel from east to west across the United States or across the peninsula of Florida, but you could travel across the last great wilds. And so these roadways really opened up not only our country, but Florida, and it really changed our landscape over a period of time. And so that's why I find the Tamiami Trail important, is because just imagine what Florida would have been like if that road wouldn't have been able to be created in the 1930s, or 1920s, I should say. That's all I have. I can take any questions that you may have. Thank you. Thanks. Yes?
You did mention Ochopee. What's the story on that?
Oh, the smallest post office is at Ochopee right now. Ochopee was a village that was eventually created primarily because of the agricultural industry. After the logging and went through the area in the 1930s and 40s, then in the 40s, 50s, there was a lot of tomato farming that took place out there and a lot of other types of farms. So Ochopee eventually was created because of that agricultural practices that were taking place. Matter of fact, there used to be a lot of large tomato canning operations out there and everything. The preserve was created in 1974, but I think Ochopee actually declined before 1974. I think it was in the late 60s that only a few families that were being successful in agriculture stayed around in that area. Very much like the large tomato farming that takes place here in Homestead and everything. Yeah. Yes? No, the loop road is open. We were doing a construction project on it a couple of years ago because we were raising the roadbed, improving hydrology beneath the roadway, and grading the roadway. So it is open now, yes. There's no closures on it whatsoever. Yes?
Do you know whatever happened to Mr. Collier?
Mr. Collier, I don't know where he passed away. But I do know that the Collier Corporation is still very active. His family is still very active, and the Collier Corporation is broken into Collier Development that deals primarily with developing Collier County, and Collier Resources that deals with agricultural interests and oil and gas interests in Collier County and things. So the family is still a very wealthy family. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Why is there big cypress and Everglades that they're adjacent? Why aren't they all just Everglades? Or big cypress?
Yeah. When the Everglades concept was being created back in the 1920s, when the idea of having this subtropical park in South Florida came about, the Park Service did send down a biologist. As a matter of fact, that biologist eventually became the first superintendent of Everglades National Park, Dan Beard. And he developed this report where he identified where or what Everglades National Park should be. And it was going to be this very vast park, matter of fact, over 2 million acres in size. And much of that original concept incorporated Big Cypress. However, there wasn't enough local public interest and support for that. So they had to really scale back what the original concept of Everglades National Park was supposed to be. So it was sort of negotiated out of the original park. And then eventually what happened is there's this concept of moving the international airport from Miami out into the middle of the Everglades in the 1960s. And that got a lot of people up in arms that were like, no way are you going to build that airport out here. And so then they set aside the land as this place called Big Cypress National Preserve. And the preserve allows for a broader spectrum of use that the park does not allow for. Yeah. Yes? Everyone drives through it, yeah. A matter of fact, Interstate 75 goes through Big Cypress as well, as does the Tamiami Trail on the southern end of the preserve. Oh, no, there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of great hiking opportunities, actually. And canoeing. The Turner River is a great place for people to go canoeing, or Halfway Creek. The preserve is 729,000 acres in size. There's a variety of different trails and boardwalks that you'd see in the brochure. And then, of course, Loop Road is a place that a lot of people want to explore as well. The majority of people do their exploration along US 41 because that's where more of the opportunities, and Loop Road, I should say, because that's where more of the opportunities are. There's not a lot of opportunities at this time along 75, but there are plans for more opportunities there. Yes?
Just more a comment, but I was hoping you could fill me in on something. That I'm a first-generation Floridian.
Oh.
I was born here in Homestead.
Yeah.
And my family was a couple that managed Paulita.
Oh, okay.
And my mother grew up there.
Yeah.
My mother and father married there.
Wow.
And I spent a goodly part of my childhood there until it was wiped out. So,
Yeah.
and I have a few photographs that may or may not interest anybody afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
But I was wondering if you had any information that maybe I can't remember or anything, because I was only about 10 or 11 when it was gone.
I don't know very much about Paulita. Nobody does, yeah. And, I don't know, it's sort of like, a lot of archaeological interesting stuff is people's trash that they never thought anything about. Not saying that any of these stations are trash or anything, but it's a gas station. And so at the time, it was probably, it's a gas station, And now it's like, well, there's none of these left, and they're sort of cool. Because if you think about it, the ability to drive into Florida, just imagine, how many of you remember driving into Florida the first time along the Tamiami Trail, escaping whatever wintry bluster that you were escaping? And, that's a big thing, and it's part of our memories now. But, I can talk to you later about it, but I don't know very much about Paulita, actually.
I'm just amazed that you even know it. I asked so many people, and even in the parks and so forth, and have a photograph of it, and it was like, nobody.
I didn't even find my first photograph of it, that postcard that I have, until about 2 years ago. So, yeah. But I'll talk to you afterwards, yes.